I never thought owning a truck would cause so much chaos in my neighborhood. To me, it was just part of my life. I used it for work, for hauling tools and equipment, for helping neighbors move furniture, and sometimes even for family trips. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, it was just a truck. But to the HOA, it was apparently the end of the world. The first sign of trouble came in, the form of a crisp white envelope taped to my front door. At first, I thought it was some junk mail or maybe a flyer for landscaping services. But when I saw the HOA's bold header, my stomach sank. Inside was a letter with a fine attached, unauthorized vehicle in driveway, 150 penalty. I laughed at first because I thought it had to be some kind of mistake. My truck was legally registered, insured, and completely within state law. There was nothing unauthorized about it, but the HOA didn't see it that way. To them, my truck was a violation of some vague line in their bylaws that said no commercial or oversized vehicles are permitted to be parked in driveways. Overnight, they didn't care that my truck wasn't oversized, that it wasn't noisy, and that I had all the legal paperwork. They just saw it as something that didn't fit the look of their perfect suburban streets. I called the HOA office the next morning to clear it up. The woman on the phone sounded disinterested, like she was reading from a script. "Sir, according to the community guidelines, your vehicle violates our rules. You need to either park it elsewhere or keep it in your garage." I told her the truck fit in my driveway just fine. And my garage was already full with my wife's car and storage boxes. She repeated the same line again, like a broken record. That's when I realized this wasn't about rules, it was about control. That night, sat at my dining table, flipping through the HOA bylaws I had downloaded from their website. The more I read, the more frustrated I got. The wording was vague, full of loopholes, and seemed designed to give the HOA unlimited power over residents. But there was one thing they clearly didn't account for: state law. I remembered a conversation I once had with a friend of mine who was also a contractor. He told me that as long as your vehicle was legally registered and classified correctly, HOAs couldn't just override state protections. My truck wasn't some giant 18-wheeler, was a heavy-duty pickup. It's perfectly within legal limits. The next morning, I decided to walk around the neighborhood just to see if maybe I was being singled out. That's when I noticed something interesting. 2 streets over, one of the HOA board members had a large trailer parked right in his driveway. Another house had an oversized SUV that clearly stretched past the sidewalk. Yet neither of them had letters taped to their doors. It was just me. The unfairness started eating at me. I wasn't going to let this slide. My wife, Sarah, could see how wound up I was getting. She put her hand on my shoulder and said, "Don't let them push you around. You've always been the guy who stands up for what's right. This is no different." And she was right, so I drafted a letter back to the HOA, attaching a copy of my truck's registration and a summary of the state statute that defined what a commercial vehicle actually was. I ended it with a firm but respectful note. My vehicle is legally registered, compliant with state law, and does not violate the spirit of the HOA bylaws. If you wish to challenge this, I am prepared to escalate further. When I slipped that letter into the HOA's Dropbox, I felt a small rush of satisfaction. But I had no idea that this was just the beginning of a battle that would spiral into something much bigger. The HOA wasn't about to back down quietly, and neither was I. When I dropped off my letter, I thought maybe common sense would finally prevail. Maybe the HOA would read the registration, realize they had no case, and quietly back off. But no. Within 3 days, another envelope showed up on my door. This time, it wasn't just a fine. It was a notice of violation with the threat of escalating penalties if I didn't comply. They doubled the fine to $300 and added a line that said if I didn't pay or remove my truck, They could take further action up to and including legal recourse. That's when I knew this wasn't going to be solved with polite letters. They weren't looking for a resolution. They were looking to bully me. Sarah shook her head when I showed her the letter. They're bluffing. They know they can't actually enforce this. But the problem was, most people in the neighborhood didn't fight back. They paid their fines, kept their heads down, and avoided trouble. That's how the HOA got away with this nonsense, by betting people wouldn't push back. Not me. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting. It was held in the community clubhouse, the same place where they posted their self-congratulatory newsletters about maintaining neighborhood standards. I walked in with a folder under my arm, my truck's paperwork, state law printouts, and pictures of those trailers and oversized SUVs I had seen in other driveways. If they wanted a fight, I was ready. The room was full of residents, most of them sitting quietly as the HOA board droned on about landscaping, noise complaints, and pool rules. When the floor opened for questions, I stood up and introduced myself. I'd like to address the fines issued against me for parking my truck in my driveway. I said loudly enough for the whole room to hear. The board members shifted in their seats, already looking annoyed. One of them, a man named Greg, with a smug smile, leaned forward. "Sir, your vehicle clearly violates our bylaws. We've already sent you notice." I pulled out my papers and held them up. This is my truck's registration. This is the state statute that defines what qualifies as a commercial vehicle. My truck doesn't fall under that category. And here, I flipped to another page, are photos of other oversized vehicles in this neighborhood, owned by board members, that were parked in plain sight without penalty. So explain to me, how exactly is this fair enforcement of your rules? The room went quiet. Some of the residents looked at each other, whispering. Greg's smug smile faltered, but he tried to recover. "Those are different circumstances," he stammered. "Different how?" I shot back. "Because they're your friends. Because they're on the board. Or is it just because you think I'm an easy target?" That hit a nerve. Greg's face turned red. The HOA president, a woman named Linda, tried to regain control of the room. "We'll review your case and get back to you." But by then, the damage was done. The residents had heard everything, and I could see it in their eyes. They were tired of the hypocrisy. 2. As I left the meeting, one of my neighbors, an older man who rarely spoke up, caught up with me. "Good job standing up to them," he said quietly. "Most of us are scared too. You might be the one who finally shuts them down." I smiled, but deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The HOA wasn't going to let me win this easily. If anything, they'd dig in harder. And I was ready for whatever came next. The very next week, I found out just how petty the HOA could get. Instead of backing down after the meeting, they doubled down. Another letter arrived in my mailbox. This one printed on heavy paper like it was supposed to intimidate me. It claimed that my truck negatively impacted neighborhood aesthetics and was a nuisance to community harmony. A nuisance. It was a pickup truck, not a circus elephant. What really made me laugh, though, was the part at the bottom. It said I had 10 days to pay the fine, or the HOA would begin proceedings to place a lien on my property. That was their favorite threat I'd heard. Put a lien on your house, scare you into submission. Most people panicked at the thought of it and gave in. But here's the thing, I wasn't most people. I called up an attorney, a guy named Marcus I'd met years ago through a friend. He specialized in property law and, more importantly, had a reputation for tearing HOAs to shreds in court. I faxed him the letters and bylaws, and when he called me back, he was chuckling. "Yeah, they don't have a case," Marcus said. "Not even close. They're bluffing, hoping you'll cave. The state law is crystal clear, and your registration proves your truck is legal. If they try to put a lien, we'll crush them." That gave me a surge of confidence. But I didn't stop there. I started digging through the HOA's own records, which were supposed to be available to residents under transparency laws. It took some persistence, but when I finally got copies, I noticed something interesting. The board members themselves had racked up exceptions over the years. Greg, the smug guy from the meeting, had an oversized boat parked in his driveway for 2 summers without a single fine. Another board member had done a major renovation without prior approval, something that would have landed any regular resident in hot water. So much for community harmony. I decided to fight fire with fire. One evening, I printed flyers with copies of the photos I'd taken of board members' vehicles, along with a copy of the bylaw they were using against me. On the bottom, I wrote in bold letters, "Why are these vehicles allowed, but mine isn't? Selective enforcement is against the law." Then I walked the neighborhood and slipped one onto every single doorstep. By the next morning, my phone was buzzing. Neighbors I barely knew were calling, thanking me for speaking up. A few even admitted they'd been fined before for ridiculous things: flower pots in the wrong color, kids' toys left on the lawn, holiday lights taken down a day late. The HOA had been bullying people for years, and now, finally, someone was pushing back. When the next board meeting rolled around, the clubhouse was packed. People who had never bothered to show up before were sitting shoulder to shoulder, holding my flyer in their hands. And for the first time since I moved into that neighborhood, I felt like I wasn't fighting alone. But the HOA wasn't done. Not by a long shot. They had one more trick up their sleeve, and they were about to play it. When I walked into that next HOA meeting, I could practically feel the tension crackling in the air. The board members were seated at the long table up front, like they were kings holding court. But this time, the room wasn't empty. Nearly every chair was filled. My neighbors' people who normally avoided these meetings had shown up, and most were carrying copies of the flyers I'd passed out. I sat near the front, my arms folded, waiting to see what new stunt they'd pull. Greg, the president, slammed his gavel like he was trying to break the table. "Order, order. We will not tolerate disruptions tonight. This meeting is for official business only." But before he could continue, one of my neighbors, an older woman named Mrs. Patterson, raised her hand. "Excuse me, Greg, but I'd like to know why you fined my grandson last year for his bicycle leaning against our garage, when you had a boat parked in your driveway for months." The room erupted with murmurs. Greg turned beet red. "This is not about me," he snapped. "This is about a resident." He pointed directly at me, who refuses to comply with our rules. I stood up slowly. "Correction. This is about an HOA board abusing its power and selectively enforcing rules against whoever they feel like punishing. My truck is legally registered, and the state protects my right to park it at my home. If you try to lien my house, I'll see you in court. And believe me, I'll win." The board shuffled papers, cluely rattled. But then they revealed their big move. Greg leaned forward, smug again. "The board has voted to amend the bylaws to prohibit all commercial vehicles in the neighborhood. Once the change is recorded, your truck will no longer be permitted. You'll have 30 days to comply." The room went quiet for a moment. Then I spoke up. "You can't enforce new rules retroactively. That's not how it works. Any amendment only applies moving forward, not to existing situations. My truck is grandfathered in, whether you like it or not." Marcus, my attorney, had schooled me well on that point. And the look on Greg's face told me he hadn't expected me to know it, before the meeting could dissolve into shouting. Another neighbor stood up, a guy named Mark, who owned a landscaping business. "If you ban commercial vehicles, you're going to hurt a lot of us," he said. "Half the people here rely on their trucks and vans for work. What's next? Banning delivery drivers? Contractors?" That's when the tide truly shifted. People started speaking up, one after another, sharing stories of how the HOA had overstepped, fined them unfairly, or threatened them. The board was completely outnumbered, their authority slipping through their fingers. And just when I thought things couldn't get more chaotic, someone from the back of the room stood up. A woman in a sharp business suit introduced herself. "My name is Angela Martinez. I'm with the County Property Oversight Committee. We've been receiving multiple complaints about this HOA. I'm here tonight to observe and gather evidence." The board members froze like they'd seen a ghost. The smugness drained from Greg's face instantly. It was clear to everyone. The HOA had finally picked a fight too big for them to win. But the battle wasn't over. They still had one last desperate card to play, and it would test everything I'd built so far. The week after that infamous meeting, I thought maybe the HOA had finally backed down. The neighbors were on my side. The oversight committee was watching them closely, and I had more legal ammunition than they could handle. But when I checked my mailbox one morning, there it was, a certified letter from the HOA. Inside was a notice of violation. According to them, had failed to comply with HOA regulations regarding commercial vehicle storage. They slapped me with another fine, this time 3 times higher than the first. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so desperate. They were cornered, and this was their last-ditch attempt to save face. Marcus, my attorney, just shook his head when I showed him the letter. "This is perfect. They've just handed us evidence of harassment. We'll file a suit for damages and legal fees." And that's exactly what we did. The court date came faster than expected. By now, word had spread throughout the neighborhood, and even the local news had picked up the story. Cameras were outside the courthouse when I walked in with Marcus, and a few of my neighbors even came to support me. Greg and the board looked like they hadn't slept in weeks. Their lawyer tried to argue that the HOA had discretionary authority over vehicles. But Marcus dismantled that claim in minutes. He presented my truck's registration, the state laws protecting commercial vehicle owners, and even pulled out a copy of the HOA's original covenants. Nowhere did it prohibit my truck. Then he hit them with the big one. The timeline of events showing how the HOA had ignored other violations by board members but singled me out. The judge's eyebrows went up more than once as Marcus laid out the hypocrisy. By the time the Oversight Committee's representative testified, it was over. The judge ruled in my favor, declared the fines void, and ordered the HOA to pay my legal costs. He even issued a warning to the board about abuse of power, noting that continued behavior like this could result in their dissolution. When the gavel came down, I felt an enormous weight lift off my shoulders. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed me with questions. I didn't brag. I didn't gloat. I just said, this was never about one truck. This was about standing up to an HOA that thought it was above the law. They were wrong. Back at home, I parked my truck in my driveway like I always had. Only this time, my neighbors came over with cold drinks, clapping me on the back and thanking me for fighting, not just for myself, but for everyone. As for Greg, he resigned from the board within a month. The HOA, humiliated and weakened, backed off entirely. New elections were held, and for the first time, people who actually cared about fairness and community took charge. My truck still sits in that driveway every night. A reminder that sometimes the best way to beat bullies is to stand firm, know your rights, and refuse to be intimidated. And to this day, whenever I fire up the engine and head to work, I smile because I didn't just protect my property. I helped free my entire neighborhood from their grip. And that's how one truck in a driveway turned into a battle that exposed an HOA's corruption and abuse of power. What started as a fine became a fight for fairness, and in the end, the truth won out. Sometimes the simplest thing like standing your ground can create real change, not just for yourself, but for your whole community. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves a good tale of justice served. Until next time, remember, know your rights, stand tall, and never let anyone push you off your own driveway.